The executioner stood upon the scaffold, awaiting the arrival of the prisoner. This experience in itself was not new to him. He had taken up this work decades before, and even if the times and methods had changed, the work itself was still quite familiar to him. Today, however, would be different, for today it was no ordinary prisoner. It wasn't because the condemned man was wealthy. The executioner had dispatched many wealthy men. It wasn't because the man was noble. The executioner had dispatched many noble-born men too. Over the nearly 40 years that he had been doing this work, he had put to death all sorts, noble, common, rich, poor. But, in all of his years, never before had he put to death someone who he had once served. The prisoner was arriving. The executioner looked around warily, looking for any sign of trouble. The day before, he had received many letters at his home, with some saying that there would be an attempt to rescue the prisoner when the time of his execution arrived. He had come prepared. Underneath his coat he came heavily armed, swords, daggers, 4 pistols, and plenty of ammunition. But, if there really was a rescue attempt, what would he do? He may have been a servant of the state, but this prisoner was once the man who led that state. Would he do the duty of the current order and try to fight off these would-be rescuers? Or would he join them, helping the prisoner escape the death that awaited him? Though it would be extremely dangerous, no small part of the executioner wanted to do the latter. But as it turned out, there would be no rescue attempt. For the prisoner, this really was the end of the line. The executioner could only watch as the prisoner was brought up to the scaffold, to his impending death, to him. It was difficult to instruct the prisoner on how to proceed. This was a man who had once been considered to have been ordained by God himself, and yet now the executioner was having to ask him to remove his coat and to bind his hands as they made their way up the scaffold. The prisoner tried to speak to the crowd, proclaiming his innocence, yet declaring that he was willing to die for the good of the nation, but the beating of the drums cut his speech off midway. Just a few moments later, the prisoner was laid down and put into place upon the guillotine. It was time. The executioner released the blade, causing it to swiftly fall and decapitate the prisoner. A moment later, one of the executioner's assistants pulled the head up from the basket to show it to the onlooking crowd. There was some cheering here and there, as was typical for a public execution, but most of the crowd stood there in stunned silence. Like the executioner himself, they all fully understood that this time, this execution, was a moment like no other. Louis Capet, the 16th of his name, formerly the King of France, was dead. Chevalier Charles-Henri Sanson de Longueval, or Charles-Henri Sanson, is an assassin-class servant in Fate Grand Order, and a man who most certainly had a lot of blood on his hands. We meet Sanson at several points in the story, first in Orleans, and more notably in Salem, as well as numerous appearances and events. We learn in-game that Sanson was an executioner, serving first for the French monarchy and later for revolutionary France after 1789. The list of people put to death by his own hand, or under his supervision, includes not just common criminals and political opponents of the regimes he served, but also includes 2 characters who can be summoned as servants in Fate Grand Order, Charlotte Corday and Marie Antoinette. But who was the real Charles-Henri Sanson? Charles-Henri Sanson was born in Paris, France, on the 15th of February, 1739, as the eldest son of Charles Jean-Baptiste Sanson. Since he was the eldest son of his father, that meant that Sanson was the presumed heir for the family business. The thing is, though, that family business was being the royal executioner in Paris for the French monarchy. The first Sanson to serve in this role was his great-grandfather, Charles Sanson, who first took up the role in the year 1688. The first Sanson passed down this office to his son, and from there it continued on down. Charles-Henri Sanson seemed destined to be the 4th of this line of executioners. Or was he? In fact, there was a chance that Charles-Henri might have been able to find a different path. In his youth, Sanson was sent to a convent school in the city of Rouen, a fair distance away from Paris, in order to get a good education. The younger Sanson developed an interest in medicine, perhaps hoping that it was a career path he could pursue that was more respectable than the family business. What do I mean by respectable? While it is true that Sanson's family did serve the King of France, and was even considered to be among the lesser nobility, executioners were not very well regarded in society. Common people feared executioners for obvious reasons, and tended to avoid them. The Sansons even had a separate pew in church, so that other people would not feel themselves tainted by their presence. It was for this reason that Sanson's father had decided to send his son away to another city, so that Charles-Henri could grow up without the taint of his family's reputation following him. Unfortunately, at a moment when Sanson's father was visiting him at the school in Rouen in 1753, when Sanson was 14, the father of a different student recognized him. This resulted in Sanson having to withdraw from the school to protect the school's reputation, receiving a private education instead, until the younger Sanson came of age, which would not be long after, because a year later, in 1754, Sanson's father was struck by an illness that left him paralyzed on one side of his body. So at the age of 15, Charles-Henri Sanson, who had hoped to follow a different path of perhaps trying to save lives, now found himself having to take up his father's role to take lives instead. He would soon be put to work, even if Sanson was still young and inexperienced when it came to the work of an executioner. It wasn't just a matter of learning how to swing a sword either. An executioner in the employ of the ancient regime needed to be able to employ a variety of methods for dispatching people. In those days, your rank in society and the nature of the crime committed determined the method of execution one would receive. Nobles would have the honor of being beheaded. Commoners were hung. The more unsavory criminals would be broken upon the wheel, and so on. And sometimes it would get much more elaborate and gruesome than that. A few years later, in 1757, the 18-year-old Charles-Henri went to the city of Rheims to assist his uncle, Nicolas Charles Gabriel Sanson, with a particularly notable execution. The man to be executed, Robert-Francois Damiens, had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV, stabbing him with a knife. The king's thick clothing managed to prevent the blade from sinking in too deep, but it still left the king wounded. Unfortunately for this would-be assassin, the punishment for an attempted regicide was severe. I'm not going to get into the gory details of how exactly Robert-Francois Damiens was executed. You can look that up for yourself if you really want to know. But let's just say that it was not quick. Sanson's uncle would actually quit his role as the executioner in Rheims after this, apparently having had enough after having to carry out such a grisly execution. The younger Sanson, however, would continue on, performing the duties of his father's office in Paris. Robert-Francois Damiens, the first person executed for attempted regicide in France for 150 years, would have many witnesses to his end, and it was exactly the sort of execution the founders of the United States had in mind when, just over 30 years later, they wrote the Eighth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, banning cruel and unusual punishments. Charles-Henri Sanson would officially succeed his father upon his father's death in 1778, also inheriting the cloak of the office, called a bureau. Sanson would have to wear this cloak when attending official functions, or performing his role, identifying him as the royal executioner. Now, personally, I'm quite glad that FGO's illustrator for Sanson did not choose to have him wear this thing. Maybe it is just my modern eyes looking at it, but it looks more like something a clown would wear, rather than someone who specialized in head removal. Later on, however, he would be allowed to choose his own clothing, donning a long, dark green frock coat, white cravat, and a top hat. Close enough. Anyway, Sanson would continue to serve in his role as the royal executioner for the French monarchy. He would also marry and have 2 sons, Gabriel and Henri, who would end up joining him as assistants for his work. I wonder if executing prisoners makes for good father-son bonding time. He likely would have continued in this role until retiring and passing into obscurity, but history had other plans for Charles-Henri Sanson. The French Revolution of 1789 would bring great changes to France, leaving nothing untouched, including the role of executioners like Sanson, who had turned 50 earlier that year. When feudalism was abolished, and the special rights and privileges of the nobility were dispensed with, that also meant an end for the class-based variation in execution methods. Now, in the new France, beheading would be the sole execution method for all, regardless of one's social standing. For Charles-Henri Sanson, this was actually a bit alarming. Being a head-removing expert with 3.5 decades of experience, he knew that being able to do this with a single swing, both to keep things clean and not make the person suffer, was actually quite hard. Blades dull, executioners tire, and both of those things could lead to mistakes. However, Sanson would soon get a new tool to work with. Using tools existing in other nations to execute criminals as an example, a new prototype machine was designed by the surgeon Antoine Louis and the engineer Tobias Schmidt. This device, initially called the Louisette, would soon be championed by a number of individuals looking for a better way to carry out executions in revolutionary France. Sanson would be one of them, and King Louis XVI himself apparently even made the suggestion that the blade be straight and angled, rather than curved like it was in other countries, which would become a bit ironic later on. But the primary advocate for this new machine would be a former member of the National Assembly, who would end up having this device named after him, Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine. Ironically, Guillotine himself was actually against capital punishment, having seen this machine as a way to move past the more barbaric execution methods commonly used, with the eventual goal of abolishing the death penalty entirely. Considering what ended up happening later on, Dr. Guillotine would come to regret his championing of the device that would end up being named after him, until his death in 1814 at the age of 75. Back to the present, Charles-Henri Sanson would soon put the new machine to the test on the 17th of April, 1792. First, it was on bales of hay, then live sheep, and finally human corpses, in order to determine how effective the machine was. It clearly received a passing grade, because a week later, on the 25th of April, 1792, a highwayman named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier became the first person ever to be executed by guillotine, with Sanson as its operator. It actually ended up being a bit of a disappointment to the crowd because it was over so quickly. Apparently, prolonged medieval-style executions were fun to watch. I don't understand that myself, but maybe I'm just a weirdo. Now that the guillotine was not only proven to work, but shown to be able to dispatch a person quite quickly, people in positions of power and influence started to get ideas. Very big ideas. If the guillotine could execute people that quickly, then that meant that larger numbers of people could be executed all at once. Sanson himself wasn't such a big fan of doing so many executions, but soon his objections became more personal. On the 27th of August, 1792, just over 2 weeks after the fall of the monarchy, Sanson was performing more executions with his sons assisting him, but while showing ahead to the onlooking crowd, his eldest son Gabriel would slip off of the scaffold, falling to his death. From then on, his second son, Henri, would take up the role of being the heir to the Sanson family. But it would only be a few months later, on the 21st of January, 1793, that Charles-Henri Sanson would forever earn his place in history, for on that day he would have to conduct the execution of a man whom he had once served, the former King Louis XVI of France. The road to this moment was long, complicated, and deeply intertwined with that of the French Revolution as a whole, but I'm not going to get into it here for 2 reasons. First, because it is not directly relevant to Charles-Henri Sanson himself, and second, because there is another character whom talking about the fate of the French royal family very much is relevant, if not the central topic to cover. In other words, the full version of this story will have to wait for a future video. For now, I will just say that after years of tension, suspicion, and conflict, the King of France found himself under arrest by his former subjects and being tried for treason. In a vote by the National Convention on the 15th of January 1793, the deputies found the king guilty by a vote of 693 to 0, with 23 abstaining. The following day came the vote for the king's punishment. This time, the vote was extremely close. 361 voted for immediate execution, 72 for execution but at a later time, and 288 against death. For those of you unlike myself who can do math like this without a calculator, then you already know that the total number of deputies was 721, and that in this final vote, it was 361 voting to execute King Louis immediately, and 360 for something else. In other words, the king had been condemned by a single vote, and the man who cast the deciding vote came as quite a personal shock to King Louis. Why is that? Well, that deciding vote belonged to none other than someone named Philippe Égalité, literally Philip Equality. Obviously, that wasn't his birth name. He changed it during the Revolution from what it had been, Louis Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, first Prince of the Blood, the head of the House of Bourbon-Orléans, a cadet branch of the main Bourbon family, started by the younger brother of King Louis XIV, with King Louis XIV being the great-great-great-grandfather of the current king. In other words, the man who cast the deciding vote to seal King Louis XVI's fate was his own cousin, and a man that, if the main Bourbon family died out, would be next in line to the French throne. Now, while I am sure many of us have had family issues in the past, or even in the present, hopefully none of us have ever had to worry about a cousin of ours actually voting for our head to get chopped off. I suspect Philippe Égalité wasn't very welcome at family get-togethers after that. All of these political issues ultimately did not relate to Charles-Henri Sanson. He was the executioner, not a member of the assembly casting the votes. That did not mean, however, that he did not have agency or his own personal concerns. The execution was scheduled for the 21st of January, 1793. The day before the execution, many letters arrived at the Sanson home. Some were pleas, begging him not to go through with the deed. More significant to Sanson, however, were the other letters, saying that there would be an attempt to rescue the king. The letters warned that if he tried to resist, Sanson would be killed. An executioner getting death threats. Interesting. Charles-Henri clearly took those letters seriously, because the next day he went to the scaffold with his aides wearing his usual long coat. Underneath that coat, he was armed to the teeth. Swords, daggers, 4 pistols, powder, and pockets full of bullets. What he would do if there really was a rescue attempt is not certain, but there are hints that he might have not only not tried to resist, but might have even joined the side of the attackers to save the king's life. This is only speculation about a counterfactual, a what-if scenario, because no such rescue attempt materialized. The king was not going to be saved. He was going to the guillotine, a device he might have helped design, and it was Charles-Henri Sanson, a man who had formerly taken up this office in the service of this very king, that was going to do the deed. And so he did. The execution of King Louis XVI was one of the defining moments of the French Revolution, and certainly the most important execution performed by Charles-Henri Sanson. Never before had a French executioner dispatched a French king, and yet, even if this was without a doubt the biggest moment of Sanson's career, it was not the last. If anything, it was only the beginning of a grim, brutal chapter in French history, the Reign of Terror. Okay, the terror hadn't actually started yet, but the extremely close vote over the king's fate provoked a showdown between the two biggest factions in the National Convention, the Montagnards, who voted for the king's death, and the Girondins, who voted against it. As the months followed, the political strife between these factions heated up, and the stakes were high. After all, the revolution, now had a king's blood upon its hands, was now at war with a host of European monarchies who were deeply offended by the execution, and the revolution's most forceful advocates still had plenty of enemies they wanted dead. And to help fuel all this, there was now that new machine that allowed an executioner to quickly dispatch many more people than ever before. Charles-Henri Sanson was going to be busy. Getting into the full details of the Reign of Terror is basically its own video, and I don't want to derail this video too much by getting too into it. In other words, I'll try, and fail, to keep this brief. What followed in the months after the king's execution was increasingly bitter factional infighting and a growing civil war in the provinces. Most of the terror's victims were actually outside of Paris, but we are going to focus on Paris, because that is where Charles-Henri Sanson was. The two factions of the Montagnards and Girondins went after each other, but it would be the Girondins who lost. Their unwillingness to vote for the execution of the king, followed by public confrontations with men like Jean-Paul Marat, men beloved by the Paris mob, ended up leading to that mob storming the convention on the 31st of May, 1793, starting several days of chaos before the leading Girondins were arrested or fled. But the next major shock to hit the French Revolution would not be caused by the Paris mob or members of the National Convention, but by a lone woman from Normandy. On the 13th of July, 1793, the notable Montagnard and favorite of the Paris Commune, Jean-Paul Marat, was stabbed to death in his bath by Charlotte Corday. 4 days later, Charlotte Corday went to the guillotine, with Charles-Henri Sanson as the executioner. Now, I didn't bring this up in my previous video on Charlotte Corday, but there was something else about her execution that was worthy of note. Charlotte's calm dignity had impressed those who saw her, and that included Sanson. So when a man named Legros, who had apparently worked on setting up the scaffold, but was not one of Sanson's assistants, pulled Charlotte's head from the basket and slapped it across the face, people were a bit upset by that. Sanson was too, and after he complained to the authorities, Legros was thrown in jail for the next few months. Considering the increasingly bloodthirsty mood of the times, the man was lucky they didn't just strap him in and take his head after Charlotte's. From then on, the terror only picked up its pace. One by one, factions and people who fell out of favor, found guilty, or merely suspected of crimes, found their way to Sanson's guillotine. Queen Marie Antoinette met her fate on the 16th of October, 1793. It was actually Charles-Henri's son, Henri, who performed the Queen's execution, rather than the elder Sanson himself, but he was there when it happened. More on that later. Leading members of the Girondins, including Jacques-Pierre Brissot, were executed on the 31st of October, 1793. Philippe Égalité, who had cast the deciding vote to execute his cousin King Louis XVI, met his fate on the 6th of November, 1793. Now he didn't actually do anything, but rather it was the actions of his son, Louis Philippe, that got him into trouble. Louis Philippe, along with General Charles-Francois Dumouriez, fled to Austria on the 4th of April, 1793. Having his son defect and so become a traitor was enough for the convention to have Philippe Égalité arrested and eventually executed, only 10 months after he himself had voted for the execution of his cousin, the king. I guess he didn't have to worry about awkward family get-togethers after all. The head removal party continued further and continued to pick up speed. More factions formed in the assembly over differences on how to conduct the ongoing terror, and so led to more factional infighting, creating more winners and losers, and so even more visitors to Sanson's guillotine. The Hébertists, named after its leader Jacques-René Hébert, the man who took up the slain Jean-Paul Marat's mantle as a firebrand journalist, were guillotined on the 24th of March, 1794. Shortly afterwards, Georges Danton himself and his allies, who were among the original architects of the terror but who had since moderated their stance, found themselves without heads on the 5th of April, 1794. Then came the big day, 9 Thermidor in year 2, or rather, the 27th of July, 1794. Yes, in their quest to start a whole new beginning with the Revolution, the First French Republic created its own calendar, with year 1 starting with the Republic's founding. Many of these sorts of proposals, like the revolutionary calendar, did not survive the French Revolution, but other proposals did. Perhaps most notable of these was a comprehensive system of measurements for distances, weight, temperature, and more, what today is known as the metric system. Anyway, enough of that tangent, and back to what you are actually here for. Beheadings. 9 Thermidor, or the 27th of July, 1794, was when the Terror at last reached its climax. It was at this moment that Maximilien Robespierre finally went too far, making a speech to the convention stating that there were still enemies to be purged, even after literally thousands of executions had already taken place across France in the past months, including many of his former friends and allies like Danton. But Robespierre's words about who these remaining enemies were so vague that members of the convention who heard his speech looked around and realized that he could very well be talking about any of them. Self-preservation kicked in, and these members of the convention decided to do Robespierre before he could do them. Arrest and a swift trial quickly followed, and the following day, the 28th of July, 1794, Robespierre and many of his most loyal followers met their fate at the guillotine they had sent so many others to die at. This would prove to be the bloodiest day of the Terror in Paris, with over 80 executions taking place in a space of less than 2 hours. I bet Sanson was quite tired when he came home that day. Okay, enough with the jokes. I've been putting a bit of extra humor into this video to try to balance out how dark and depressing all of this is, but now I need to say something serious. I went through the major purges of the Terror here, but these were far from the only executions that Sanson had to oversee. Between the major names, like King Louis XVI, Charlotte Corday, Queen Marie Antoinette, Brissot, Hébert, Danton, and Robespierre, are many, many more. Some were guilty as charged, but many were not. Some were like Philippe Égalité, who did nothing themselves, but were connected enough with someone who was, that their fate was sealed. People whose only crime was being connected to someone who did something, or in the later phases of the Terror, simply being suspected, or dispatched because of what they might do, rather than anything they actually did, with Georges Danton probably being the most famous of this sort. The fact is that Charles-Henri Sanson, in his role as the executioner for an increasingly paranoid and bloodthirsty regime, would carry out hundreds of executions upon those who did nothing to deserve their fate. And he knew it. He knew it, but could do nothing without jeopardizing himself and his family. There would still be more executions during the French Revolution, but the Terror was now over, and the pace would slow considerably from here on. So too would the career of Charles-Henri Sanson. The following year, in 1795, with age, ill health, and the strain of the past few years taking its toll on him, Charles-Henri formally passed his office down to his son, Henri, and retired at the age of 56. His 41-year-long career as an executioner was over. Charles-Henri would spend his final years quietly, moving away from Paris to live at a country home his father once had. No longer involved in the events of the French Revolution or the rise of Napoleon, the former executioner took up gardening and spent time with his family. Charles-Henri Sanson, the fourth of the Sansons to serve as executioners in Paris, and who became known as the Great Sanson, died on the 4th of July, 1806, at the age of 67. His son Henri would continue in the Sanson office, before himself retiring and passing it to his own son, Charles-Henri's grandson. This Sanson, Henri Clement, the sixth in the line of executioners, would turn out to be the last, when his own career ended in 1847. This final Sanson, however, would compile the notes and diaries of his ancestors, including Charles-Henri, and turn them into a memoir in 1862. That memoir, though compiled long after his death, does give at least some window into what the great Sanson thought about his career, particularly during its most pivotal moments. The picture the memoir paints is one of a man who took his work seriously, seeing it as a grim necessity. It also reveals a man who is increasingly disturbed by the work he had to do, questioning whether or not he could carry on as the revolution demanded more from him. He wrote of his unease about executing King Louis XVI, admiration for Charlotte Corday, trying to soothe Queen Marie Antoinette in her brief moments of fear, and many, many more stories. Stories of those terrified, those who were polite to the man who was about to dispatch them, those outraged at the injustice of their fate. The longer the Terror went on, and as it expanded in scope, The more disturbed Sanson seemed as he found himself having to execute those who clearly did not deserve it, but for whom he could do nothing. The horror in his accounts gets worse and worse until, suddenly, the diary entries stop, Sanson seeming to have reached a breaking point about a month before 9 Thermidor. He did manage to recover enough for when it was Robespierre's turn, but nothing like the detail of earlier writings. Nevertheless, despite all of this, Sanson remained committed to what he saw as his duty, feeling that it was something he could not walk away from, no matter how distasteful he found it to be. Charles-Henri Sanson is one of the most prolific executioners in the history of the world. During his long career of 41 years, it is believed that Sanson may have executed as many as 3,000 people, with most of them happening during the nearly 11 months of the Reign of Terror. As far as executioners go, only one man, who also worked for a regime obsessed with purging its enemies, seems to have a higher body count than Charles-Henri Sanson, Wassily Blokhin, who served as the chief executioner of Joseph Stalin's NKVD. The Charles-Henri Sanson we meet in Fate Grand Order is actually pretty close to his historical counterpart, though some changes have been made. I already discussed his character design a bit, and how while it isn't quite as accurate as it is for Charlotte Corday, it is at least close enough to the only artistic depiction we have of Sanson. One thing to note, however, is something that is in his third ascension. Charles-Henri's design doesn't change very much between his ascension forms, but he does gain some elaborate shoulder decorations, depicting the heads of 4 horses. Now, I refrain from getting into the gory details of the execution of Robert-Francois Damiens way back in 1757, but there was a moment during that drawn-out mess where 4 horses got involved. These shoulder decorations on Sanson's character design is, most likely, a reference to that event, with the rest of his outfit more or less conforming to his historical depiction. Regarding Sanson's skill set, his first skill is executioner. I don't really need to explain how this relates to Sanson, do I? It gives him a pretty substantial damage buff against those with an evil alignment, which no doubt is something the real Sanson would have preferred when it came to doing his work, since he clearly struggled with the number of innocents he had to dispatch during the Terror, but less so with the actually guilty. His second skill, medicine, heals a targeted ally and removes their debuffs. This is likely a reference to his attempts in his early years to study medicine rather than follow the family business. It is worth noting as well that a man like Sanson, quite well versed in the taking of lives, probably would have learned much about helping them as well, simply by having so much first-hand knowledge of the damage that could be done, what was survivable and what was not. And following that line of thought, his third skill is human study, which gives him a bonus attack damage against human enemies. Considering what Sanson did for a living, and even though he was not a warrior, I don't doubt that he was quite knowledgeable when it came to harming humans. But expanding upon this, I did see a few bits and pieces about Sanson perhaps donating the corpses of execution victims to doctors for research purposes, but I did not see enough evidence of that to address it before now. Perhaps he did do that, but I do not have enough information about it. Sanson's noble phantasm, La Mort Espoir, is, well, it is exactly what you would expect him to get. He summons a guillotine, which is promptly used upon the targeted enemy. It focuses damage upon a single enemy, has a low chance to instantly kill the target, and decreases their defense for 3 turns. Frankly, this feels underpowered to me. I mean, Sanson is a low-rarity servant, but a guillotine having a low chance to instantly kill the target? Shouldn't that be, a pretty high chance of instantly killing the target? Okay, I know instant death as a game mechanic is unreliable against any enemy that is actually dangerous, but still. Oh well. At least we got to see a neat animated demonstration of this NP early on in the Solomon movie. As for Sanson's character in Fate Grand Order, he has made a notable appearance in 2 major storylines so far, as well as a few bit parts and events. But as for the first of those major story appearances, that in the Orleans singularity, well, there's a complication. Since Orleans is literally the first singularity you do after finishing the prologue in Fuyuki, I'm not going to bother with trying to cover up spoilers. In Orleans, the altar version of Jeanne d'Arc summons a number of servants to do her bidding, then infects them all with madness enhancement, to try to help with her effort to destroy France in retaliation for her execution, or rather for France failing to save her from the English, who did the actual executing. Upon seeing that Marie Antoinette opposes her, Jean Alter calls for Sanson, who in the Fate world is the one who executed Marie. Now, two things about this. First is that historically it was his son Henri, not Charles-Henri himself, who actually executed Marie Antoinette. The elder Sanson was there when it happened, and was even helping the queen up to the scaffold, but he was not the actual executioner that day. Now, I give this a pass for creative license, because swapping it to be Charles-Henri rather than his son who executed Marie creates a rather interesting character dynamic between them, with Marie having to be face-to-face with her executioner. I rather enjoy it when the Fate franchise gives us these kind of character interactions, of old friends or foes meeting again, people who held similar roles in life but did things very differently, heroes meeting people who inspired them, and so much more. So for that, I'm perfectly okay with them making Charles-Henri to be Marie Antoinette's executioner rather than his son. But the second thing for me to mention about Sanson's portrayal in the Orleans storyline is a bit of a problem. Jean Alter's addition of madness enhancement to all of the servants she summons has a dual effect, increasing their strength, but also twisting their personalities. This madness ends up turning Sanson more into a crazed killer, rather than a professional executioner. In one moment, he's saying things to Marie that seem like a very disturbing desire for her affection, and in another, he begs her for forgiveness for having taken her life. Now, him asking to be forgiven is much more in line with Sanson's character in the rest of FGO, and was probably a moment of his true self resurfacing, despite Jean Alter's madness enhancement. A far more lengthy and interesting storyline that Charles-Henri Sanson found himself in was the last of the epic of remnant singularities, Salem. Now, on the one hand, I'm going to be a bit more careful about spoilers here, but on the other, Salem is such an infamous name for anyone who knows anything about colonial America that it isn't hard to figure out some of what happens in that storyline, even if they know nothing at all about FGO. Sanson is part of the team of servants that goes with you to try to deal with the Salem singularity. Initially, there's a bit of comedy here as the Frenchman Sanson finds himself in an English settler colony, but that is only early on. Before long, Charles-Henri ends up in a world that is uncomfortably familiar to the one that he lived, a town rife with paranoia, accusing those it sees as the cause of their problems, and so leading to the deaths of those who very likely do not deserve it. This is basically just like what Sanson saw during the Reign of Terror, though on a far smaller scale, since in Paris during the Terror, more people were often guillotined in a single day than the combined total of everyone who died during the Salem witch trials. Faced with such a familiar situation, Sanson will try to stop the madness that takes place in Salem, both for his sense of justice and his feelings of guilt over his actions in life. Charles-Henri Sanson is a pretty solidly portrayed character in Fate Grand Order. While some artistic license is taken with his character design and the real history, it is close enough to the true Sanson that I at least am not bothered by any of the changes. His appearance in Orleans was twisted, but we got to see much more of his true self in Salem, where he was one of the central characters. Like most characters in FGO, Sanson is not exclusively part of serious or dramatic storylines. His most recent appearance in a storyline on the NA version of the game, that during the Holy Grail Phantom Thief event in March 2023, saw him going undercover as a doctor at the museum, where the rest of the cast was planning a heist to take the museum's Holy Grail. Sanson seemed to rather enjoy the chance to take part in something where he did not have to kill anyone and was able to engage in elaborate crime that still served a moral purpose. The weight of his past will likely always remain with him, and in personality he remains the severe and professional executioner that he was in life. But in Chaldea, the great Sanson, Charles-Henri Sanson, seems to be able to find a measure of peace from the bloody and troubling life that he lived. If you would like to learn more about the life and times of one of the many people that Charles-Henri Sanson had put to death, check out my earlier video on Charlotte Corday here. I hope to see all of you again very soon. Thank you for watching.